Welcome to this episode of the ISF podcast from the Information Security Forum, the leading authority on cyber, information security, and risk management. I'm Tavia Gilbert, and I'm glad to welcome you back to another cutting-edge conversation tailored to CISOs, CTOs, CROs, and other global security pros. In today's episode, as we approach the start of the new year, ISF CEO Steve Durbin breaks down the top 5 threats for security professionals to guard against in 2021. This is my favorite conversation of every year. I think last year you might have said this was the conversation to keep you awake at night.
Yes, yeah.
So
there's always an annual keep you awake at night conversation, isn't there? And this is it.
And obviously, with the COVID-19 pandemic still going on, that's got to be the backdrop for this conversation. Do you agree?
I think that is unfortunately true, Tavia. You know, the pandemic has provided the overall context. Normally, I would talk about the increase in data, the increase in the way in which we're sharing information, and all of that is true because it is still continuing to grow at an exponential rate. But I think that what the pandemic has done is present some very real both challenges and opportunities to organizations with having to really stand up a whole number of effective home offices that are accessing information from all around the world, in some instances, in a secure fashion. So it's been a very busy 2020 for security professionals. And I think the bad news is that it's not going to get too much easier, I don't think, as we move into 2021, because some of the fundamentals around the pandemic are not going to change in the short term, unfortunately. So security professionals increasingly having to turn their attention to what 2021 might bring. And one of the things that very many of them, certainly within the ISF, do is rely on our threat horizon reports. But they look out 2 years. And I think that whilst that's valuable, and we'll talk about the upcoming new threat horizon report probably within a sort of February, March timeframe next year in one of our podcasts, what is probably more important at this sort of stage in the year is to really focus on what we might expect over the next 12 months. Mm-hmm. And there have been a couple of things I think that are going to remain with us that have really taken advantage, if I could put it that way, of the pandemic. I'm referring in that instance to cybercrime. So we saw cybercrime increase in 2020. We saw ransomware in particular increase. That, I think, is going to remain a top concern in 2021 for a couple of reasons. First of all, very often we talk about crime as a service, so the ability to buy crime kits, if I could put it that way. Ransomware has certainly now got into that kind of space. It's relatively easy to buy a ransomware kit. It's relatively inexpensive. And we're seeing an increase in that. We're seeing an increase in malware targeting user data so that it can be used in fraud. I think that people working from home, particularly those that are spending a lot of time in front of a screen, you suffer from cyber fatigue. You aren't perhaps as really on your game as you might be at certain times in the day. Mm-hmm. And cyber criminals know that. And so they know the right time to be dropping particular opportunities for themselves on you. I think we'll continue to see things like, network intrusion for the theft of intellectual property. We saw that with some of the vaccines being developed for the pandemic. Wow. We saw, hacking from Korea, for instance, in that area. I think some of that will continue as well. And I think we're also going to see an uptick in social engineering to facilitate all types of cybercrime. Again, because we're spending so much more time in what some might say are less secure environments, using a variety of different devices to do all sorts of things that combine both personal and work. And again, that presents a whole range of opportunities, particularly through social media and so on, for cyber criminals. So I think that 2021 is going to unfortunately see this continued increase and development of cybercrime, which affects, of course, not just organizations, but also individuals.
We've talked so much about the human element, so I just want to reinforce this point, that cyber criminals are very much aware of human psychology and human behavior, and so we must be aware of the same in order to safeguard our security.
Yeah, I think it's a very important point. I think that for a lot of security professionals, of course, they know this, but a lot of other people still, I think, view cyber criminals as these sort of hoodie-clad individuals, hunched over kitchen tables, and nothing could be further from the truth. They are very large corporations. They are adept at collaborative working. They know what they're good at. They spend a lot of time just watching what we do. And therein lies the real danger because, a cyber criminal could be living on your organizational network for 3, 4, 6 months, really just watching what's going on before they make any move at all. And that's one of the real challenges I think that organizations face increasingly is, how do you know when you're being watched? And of course, if nothing's happening, nothing untoward is going on, it's very, very difficult until something goes wrong. So I think that's absolutely right. They are professional organizations.
So that's an outside malicious actor, but we know, of course, that threats are not just from outsiders with bad intentions, so let's talk about the insider threat. That's a conversation we've had in the past, and it's still a weak point for organizations, isn't it?
I think it is. And I think that unfortunately, we'll probably see more of this in 2021. And it's related to what I was just talking about in terms of things like cyber fatigue and people, just, I don't know whether it's becoming complacent or whether it's just forgetting. I think that there are some security professionals who will say to you that, one of the biggest challenges they face is not having people in an office environment because they don't know what they're doing. They can't see what they're doing. And I think that, back to my point about cybercrime increasing with things like social engineering and so on, we also have to take into account that COVID has had a significant impact on businesses in terms of their ability to continue functioning. So we're also starting to see, unfortunately, redundancies and people being let go. So that raises a whole range of potential insider threat there. And as you know, because we've talked about it in the past, that, we do categorize insider into 3 areas, the malicious, the negligent, and the accidental. Probably the one that I would be more concerned about in 2021 is the accidental. So this is where there isn't any conscious decision at all for an individual to act inappropriately. There's no motive there to cause harm to an organization. It's simply we're making mistakes because perhaps we aren't taking time away from screens. We aren't mindful of the fact that you can only go so long on a Zoom call or whatever it might be before you do become very, very tired. And it's much more tiring to have that kind of meeting than it is to do it in person. So again, it's about making sure, I think, that individuals are aware that they need to be doing the simple things like taking breaks, like moving away from the screen, going for a walk, doing all of the things to break up some of that, what I would call cyber monotony, because otherwise the accidental insider becomes very real. And the accidental insider is, of course, somebody who makes a mistake unwittingly, unknowingly, perhaps. Could be as simple as sending an email to the wrong person that has a file attached to it. And that, I think, is one of the things we'll see more of in 2021.
Related to this issue of insider threat, 2021 is going to see the digital generation coming of age, with an increase in Gen Zers moving into the workforce. So what will this anticipated cultural shift mean from a security standpoint?
One of the things we're seeing, and this is why it's relevant for next year, is we're seeing an increase in Gen Z moving into the workforce. Why is that so important from a security standpoint? Well, lots of research has been done into Gen Z. They are the first real, totally digitally native generation that we've seen moving into the workforce. And they have a very different way of viewing some of the traditional security. So if you think about that particular age group, what we've done is we've taken them through the school systems, the college, university systems. We've encouraged them to collaborate. We've encouraged them to share. Social media has been very big for them. And then we move them into a work environment, and suddenly some of those processes and policies no longer reflect what we've been training them and teaching them to do for up until that point. And so we shouldn't be surprised at some of the attitude that still exists in the work environment to share information online. So they are developing new norms around security and privacy. And I think, smart organizations need to adapt to that. They are going to need to change some of the way in which they work in order to accommodate that particular generation, because they're not going to go away and we're not going to be able to change them. There's some interesting survey that Microsoft did back actually in 2018 that pointed out that Gen Z was most vulnerable to scams. And that, of course, is surprising given that they're also the most digitally aware. But it is because of the way that they have traditionally looked at things in terms of the sharing, the heavy reliance on technology. And so that really, from an organizational standpoint, we need to be adapting our training and awareness materials to cater for that. And we also need to be paying special attention to things like our social media policies and our use of technology. So it's a real strong focus that's needed on awareness and really human-centered security. And there's a range of different support materials from the ISF in that particular area. But, I think if we talk about the increase in cybercrime, we talk about some of the insider threat issues, and then we add to it the fact that we're getting a range now of newcomers into the workplace with an entirely different perspective. You add all of those three things up, and I think we're going to see some real challenge in 2021 for those organizations that aren't really grasping the opportunity to make change in this awareness area.
I think that's a really interesting point, and it really highlights the need for security to be integrated into all aspects of the business. I mean, here's a golden opportunity for security to collaborate with HR on how to best introduce these policies to new employees that are just coming into the workforce. So we've covered the general increase in cybercrime, insider threat, and Gen Z coming into the workforce. Let's move on to our fourth emerging threat of 2021, edge computing. Why is edge computing on the list, Steve?
The reason that I pull this out as a threat for next year, for 2021, is that what edge computing does is push security, what we've termed, to the brink from an ISF standpoint. What do I actually mean by that? Well, edge computing provides a really attractive architectural choice for organizations because it allows you to have very high speed processing being carried out at the point at which it's required. So what you're doing is you're really spreading across your potential corporate network, extended corporate network, the processing power. So that means you're bringing data closer to the individual. That, of course, from a security standpoint, creates a whole range of different points of failure and really causes you to have to look very hard at some of the more perhaps traditional security solutions that you might have put in place in your organization. And what it's doing is really pulling together some of the things that security professionals absolutely hate. So it's spreading information across a wide area. It's increasing the speed of both processing and access to that information. And it's opening up not just digital, but also potential physical security weaknesses. And so you've got all of those different things that are combining together. So, why are organizations doing it? Well, because it makes perfect sense. It's a more effective way of managing your computer processing power, but it does mean that you can lose visibility of security. So you need to have invested in your analysis capabilities. You need to be taking into account the fact that you're going to have cloud providers, so third parties also providing some form of computing processing power for you in there. And you need to be aware of the fact that attackers potentially could exploit some of those blind spots, whether that be at the device level, so physical, or indeed on these extended networks. So the real sort of advice for security professionals in this particular space is that if you are moving towards an edge computing architecture across your organization, and I think many more people will be doing that in 2021 because of the way that the nature of work has changed, you need to be physically conscious of what's going on across your extended network, reviewing that physical level of security, reviewing some of the potential points of failure, and really building that into not just your resilience planning, but also your risk assessments. And I think we're going to have to end up with some form of hybrid security approach that takes into account, as I say, the physical nature with cloud, with the drive towards edge computing. And lots of organizations have recognized that already. And so they're combining within, what was the Chief Information Security Officer role, the physical element as well as a means of really dealing with that.
Last but not least for our emerging threats of 2021 is digital transformation. As technology becomes more complex, I understand that many organizations are undergoing more complex or complicated changes within their infrastructure. We can just assume that that's going to go perfectly smoothly, right?
Well, if you think about all of the different things that we've just been talking about, some of the different challenges, we're pushing our critical assets further and further away from the sort of the mothership, if I could put it that way. So we're having to necessarily trust people with accessing that information from remote locations. We're having to trust our third-party providers. But I think that one of the other things that perhaps we might forget in all of that is that we're also having to update our infrastructure systems, because very many organizations, have reached a point where they have to be making certain investments in digital transformation. So they have to be continuing to build new systems. They have to be taking advantage of some of the real opportunities that exist out there. And that means that they're going to be putting new systems on top of old, whether those old systems are human systems that we need to trust in, or whether they happen to be old architecturally designed technology-based systems. But increasingly, we're going to be seeing organizations restructuring the way that they do business. That means that if the systems don't work or they're not integrated effectively, that introduces new vulnerabilities, introduces new attack vectors, and ultimately, of course, has the impact of destroying trust in our consumer relationship, in our employee relationship, in our supply chain relationship. So organizations, understandably, next year, I think, are going to be pushed towards speeding up some of the digital transformation in the light of some of the impacts that pandemic has had in the way in which we're adapting to work. But that's going to present some other opportunities from a cybercrime standpoint. And so I think that really what we're going to have to do is to just step back a little bit, just assess whether some of the plans we've got have a dependency on legacy systems or underlying systems that perhaps we're unsure of. That applies, of course, to organizations that are on an acquisition trail at the moment too. You know, we shouldn't forget that during a recession, there is normally quite a lot of merger and acquisition activity that takes place. So again, you know, from a security standpoint, you really need to be involved in some of those assessments before the button's pressed on acquiring some of these organizations. So what can security do? I think it is about engaging better with the business to make sure that they're involved during the planning stages of any digital transformation, whether that be simply reacting to the new way of working, or whether it be because there's a merger or an acquisition that is being planned.
Right, and we know that that deeper engagement with the rest of the business is so key to better security overall. Any other advice you'd offer savvy security leaders about 2021's coming threats?
I think one of the things that we have to see us all get better at, because of some of the things I've just been talking about in 2021, is this alignment of security and business. You know, why does a security strategy exist? It exists only, in my view, to support the business. And if you think about some of the threats we've just been talking about, you know, some of them are clearly attacks on the organization. So we're looking at trying to put in some preventative measures. We're also talking about resilience, of course. We're trying to anticipate some of those things. But a lot of them as well are really geared around the way in which the business wants to go forward in 2021. And so security has to, I think, really be much more closely aligned with corporate strategy in terms of really getting arms around what it is that the business is looking to do in 2021. And so really taking, I would say, much more of a business perspective to things like ensuring or supporting, you know, the integrity or the availability of the assets across an organization. And I include people in that as well. It isn't just about technology. It's also about people. It's about looking at how security really can support the drive to provide new products and services to customers, how it can support some of the required operating capability in the form of perhaps evolving or changing business processes, perhaps if the organization is moving down a sort of edge computing route or going through a process of transformation or acquisition. So this business security alignment is hugely important.
Let's talk a little bit about the ISF Cyber Resilience Framework. ISF has done a lot of research around cyber resilience and how organizations can not just anticipate security issues, but also respond to situations when they do happen.
Well, one of the things that I think we're all going to have to get a little bit better at in 2021 is anticipating where some of the challenges might be coming from a security standpoint, but also putting in place a response mechanism that allows you to really understand what's going on. So one of the things that we always talk about at the ISF is the need for strong situational awareness. The organization needs to have a strong process in place that's completely in line with its risk appetite for analyzing and gathering information around cyber intelligence. So this can be through working with other ISF members, for instance. It can be through trade associations, variety of different things. But the important piece is that you keep that awareness of what's happening in the security space very high. It also means that you need to work collaboratively with third parties and other organizations, because what you're trying to do is build out a way of responding and assessing your organization's ability to respond to an attack. So a key component, in addition to the situational awareness, is really assessing how you as an organization are able to respond, perhaps to some of the threats that I've just been talking about. And there's a number of different ways that you can do that using ISF tools. Of course, there are things like our threat radars, there's our risk assessment tools, there's our benchmarking tools, and many other organizations have similar things as well. But the real point I'm making here is to effectively provide the right level of insight as to your capability to respond to some of the threats we've been talking about, and those that undoubtedly will also come your way. You have to have planned for them. You have to have worked collaboratively across the organization to have a degree of understanding of the different roles that everybody is going to play come the day that a breach or an attack takes place. And you also need to be understanding from the security professional perspective where the critical assets are in the organization. And the only way you can do that is through communication right the way up and down the organization. Sometimes what we call a cybersecurity advisory board might be able to help with that in terms of providing you with access into different elements of the organization. Other times it's being done on a much more informal basis. But the job of security is to try to make sure that the organization has all of the information that's required so that when an attack takes place, the organization can respond to it effectively and get systems back up and running as quickly as possible, maintaining not just a level of service, but also confidence in the ability to deliver service to the people that matter. And inevitably, that's the customers, shareholders, employees.
All the way through to the board.
Indeed, absolutely.
Before we wrap up, I just want to review the 5 emerging threats we've covered today. The rise in cybercrime, insider threat, Gen Z coming into the workforce, the rise of edge computing, and organizations ramping up digital transformation. A solid security plan to defend against these threats will need to incorporate resilience, strategies for risk management, governance and compliance, technology and services, supply chain integrity, and training and supporting your workforce. Those must certainly all be areas that the ISF itself will be concentrating on in its response to these emerging threats for 2021. Is that right?
You're absolutely right, Tavia. They are the fundamentals. Any organization has to be prepared for a threat to have an impact on it. And that's where the resilience piece comes in. We continually update our advice to members on governance, on the way that the frameworks are developed, on the changes that need to be made, because of course the other thing that's happening is that regulation and legislation is continuing to change as well in terms of reflecting some of the things we've just been talking about. So that's a fundamental piece as well. And I think that, one of the other areas that I'm always concerned about is the way that we share information and potentially the threat that presents. So the supply chain, of course, and some of the services and the technologies that we use really come into play there, as you rightly point out, particularly as we're going to continue, I think, to have people working remotely through at least part of 2021, probably through at least the first 6 months, I would suggest. And of course, that means we need to look after our people as well. So I think that those 5 areas that you highlighted there are absolutely spot on. And yes, the ISF will continue to provide support for members and indeed others in all of those different areas, applying the knowledge and experience that we have to the different scenarios that no doubt will continue to evolve.
Well, thank you for taking us through this latest threats to keep you up at night. Always a pleasure.
Hopefully not going to keep you up too much.
COVID does plenty of that, so. Listeners, we hope this episode has been helpful for you as you prepare for the year ahead, whatever that might hold. We will include a link to the ISF's Cyber Resilience Framework Executive Summary in the show notes. So if you're interested in learning more, you can access that resource online. We're taking a break for the holidays, but we'll be back in the second week of January with a new season of the ISF podcast. In Season 2, we'll continue to focus on leadership, but we'll look more specifically at leadership in times of transition. We're excited to bring you those conversations and hope that they inspire and inform you. In the meantime, we invite you to tune into our catalog of video and podcast episodes, all of which you can find at securityforum.org. You can subscribe to the audio feed wherever you get your podcasts, and we'd be so grateful if you'd recommend us. Growing our subscriber numbers helps us reach new audiences and helps us continue to bring you these timely conversations. You can always join in the conversation on our LinkedIn page or get in touch directly through our website, where you can download ISF's research, practical tools, and guidance related to discussions like these. The ISF podcast is produced by Talkbox and Tavia Gilbert. Assistant producer, Katie Flood. Music by Alexander Filipiak. Mix and master by Brian Barney. Thanks for listening.